Hello, I'm Dr. Will Baker from the Centre for Global Englishes at the University of Southampton. In this presentation I'm going to talk to you about intercultural education in the classroom. So we'll be combining what we've talked about already in terms of the diverse uses of global Englishes for intercultural and transcultural communication and the need to change the models and goals of language use and language learning from a native speaker to an intercultural speaker. So given the use of English as a global language for intercultural communication, how can we best teach through and about the English language? So in this presentation we're going to look at 4 intercultural education approaches. And these revolve around 4 particular areas: critical, non-essentialist and non-stereotype perspectives on language and culture, with an increased recognition of multilingualism and interculturality. A focus on processes of communication rather than the products of communication, intercultural communicative competence and intercultural awareness, as we discussed in the previous presentation, and moving away from a native speaker model to an intercultural speaker and an intercultural citizen. And in particular, we'll explore intercultural awareness in the classroom through 5 areas. Before we look at the 4 different approaches, I think it would be helpful to provide an overview of current approaches to culture in language classrooms. So over the last 30 years or so, the intercultural has become an increasing part of both theory and language policy, but it is often not translated into practice, so it doesn't happen in the classroom. So even though lots of theory about language teaching and language learning and language use has intercultural elements, and even though lots of, for example, government policies on teaching languages have intercultural elements, typically it does not make it into the classroom. Culture and the intercultural in teaching is often an ad hoc or a 5th skill, added after everything else has been taught, and it's also frequently marginalised and left out if there isn't enough time. Where culture and language are brought together in the language classroom, it's often stereotyped and simplistic. So there's typically national level links between languages and cultures. A focus on touristic images that tell us little about the everyday communicative practices of people in that community, and even less about how language is used for intercultural communication. As Claire Cramps 30 years ago noted, there's typically a focus on what she called the 4 Fs: food, festivals, folklore and facts. And these are all cultural products, not processes, and actually not very likely to help us much for intercultural communication. So what are the alternatives? Well, beginning, I would say, would be critical approaches to language and culture. So Phipps and Guilherme describe a critical pedagogy for intercultural education as a critical use of language, a critical approach to one's own and other cultural backgrounds, and a critical view of intercultural interaction. So what does this mean? This means exploring the prevailing discourses of culture, particularly national cultures, and challenging stereotype views. Recognition of second language use and global Englishes as multilingual and intercultural, as opposed to the frequent stereotype of monolingual and monocultural speakers. Providing space for reflection on learners and teachers' own intercultural experiences, and engagement in intercultural communication and culturally different communities. The second area is a focus on process, not products. So learners can never be prepared with knowledge of all the cultural practices and settings that they may encounter in intercultural and transcultural communication through global Englishes, simply because the global Englishes is used in such a diverse range of settings with such a diverse set of users that there is no way everyone can have knowledge of all of those settings and users. So this means we need to shift the focus of teaching away from final products, i.e. knowledge of linguistic forms and functions, since we can never have knowledge of all of the possible linguistic products, and instead we need to focus on the processes of communication and intercultural communication. No one set of linguistic forms, cultural practices or communicative strategies will be appropriate in all contexts, so L2 users need to be prepared to negotiate different linguistic and cultural practices. Now it's important to stress that the focus on process does not dismiss products. So linguistic and cultural products, so for example knowledge of grammar, vocabulary and pronunciation, as well as information about other cultures, still have an important place in language teaching. However, knowledge of this should not be viewed as the end product. Rather, linguistic and cultural products can be presented as examples of communicative practices, and they can be explored and then adapted, with any knowledge gained always viewed as provisional and continually open to reflection and revision as new experiences come in. The third area is moving from communicative competence to intercultural communicative competence and awareness. So communicative competence is expanded beyond linguistic competence to include the knowledge, skills and attitudes needed for intercultural communication. So in the previous presentation we looked at Michael Byram's intercultural communicative competence, which added to communicative competences linguistic, sociolinguistic and discourse competence, and added the intercultural element with the 5 savoirs: attitudes, knowledge, skills of interpreting and relating, skills of discovery and interaction, and critical cultural awareness. In specific relation to global Englishes and English as a lingua franca, we looked at intercultural awareness in the previous presentation as well. So this included the knowledge, skills and attitudes needed for intercultural and transcultural communication through global Englishes, and removal of the intercultural line between cultures and languages. So intercultural awareness was defined as a conscious understanding of the role culturally based forms, practices and frames of reference can have in intercultural communication, and an ability to put these concepts into practice in a flexible and context-specific manner. And then the fourth area of intercultural education is moving from the native speaker model to an intercultural speaker and an intercultural citizen. So the models and goals for teaching need to move from the inappropriate, idealised monolingual native speaker to a multilingual intercultural speaker or citizen. Yeah, and this is much more relevant for learners and teachers in how they will use global Englishes. The intercultural speaker has the competencies and awareness of intercultural communicative competence and intercultural awareness. They have knowledge, skills and attitudes of multilingual English use for intercultural and transcultural communication. Now the intercultural citizen can be seen as a further expansion of the intercultural speaker. So like the intercultural speaker, they have competence of ICC and ICA, or intercultural awareness, but this is also combined with active engagement in diverse communities from the local to the global. Overall, there needs to be a flexible and adaptable approach to communication through the second language, and again, as I argued before, many local teachers already provide an excellent example of intercultural speakers and intercultural citizens. So how can we put these 4 key areas into practice in the classroom? So what we're going to do now is look at intercultural awareness in particular, and 5 strands or areas in which we can develop this within the language classroom. So these 5 strands are: firstly, exploring the complexity of local cultures; secondly, exploring cultural representations in learning materials; thirdly, exploring cultural representations in the media and arts, both in digital and traditional mediums; fourthly, making use of cultural informants; and fifth, engaging in intercultural communication, both face-to-face and digitally. And I'll now talk about each of those 5 areas in a little more detail. So the first area, exploring the complexity of local cultures. Through looking at their own cultural backgrounds, students can learn about the diversity and complexity of cultural groups in their own settings. And this will help them to develop an awareness of the complexity of other cultures too. As they realise that their own cultures are far from monolingual and monocultural, they will also, hopefully, become aware that this applies to other cultures too. So even apparently monolingual and monocultural classes typically contain a degree of cultural and linguistic diversity around areas such as different heritage languages, different religions, ethnicities and family backgrounds. Approaches within this strand may include things such as class discussions, mini ethnographic projects describing local cultural groups, where students do a short, in-depth investigation of a local community. The second area is exploring cultural representations in learning materials. Teaching materials, and particularly textbooks, are often a central part of teaching and so offer a prime medium for exploring cultural and intercultural communication. However, it needs to be recognised that the presentation of cultural and intercultural in learning materials is frequently limited and often stereotyped or essentialist. Nonetheless, even stereotyped materials can be useful in developing intercultural awareness if they are approached critically. So, for example, students can explore images of their own and other cultures in the materials and consider how well or not they reflect their own understanding and experiences. They can also reflect on what has been included and what is missing. And what is missing is often very important, and think about the reasons why this might be. Through this, learners can develop the skills needed to make critical evaluations and comparisons of cultural representations, including their own and other cultures. The third area is exploring cultural representations in the media and arts, both in digital and traditional mediums. So the arts, and particularly literature, have long been used in language teaching as a means of including cultural content. So typically in 19th century approaches to learning a language, you would also study the great novels of the language, with the idea being that this would give you a greater insight into the culture that was associated with the language. And this is something that still continues to this day. But we can also add other cultural sources to language teaching. So cultural content can be included from media sources such as movies, televisions, radios and magazines, and over the last few decades this can be paralleled with online digital sources such as news websites, blogs and podcasts. So we have cultural content from both Anglophone and non-Anglophone settings that use English. So good sites for this are things like BBC, Al Jazeera, NHK in Japan. All of these have English language news outlets which refer to many different cultural contexts. And in this way, students develop awareness of the diverse global roles of English and its links to varied cultural settings. Many online sources also provide learners with examples of hybrid and fluid cultural forms and practices that are not linked or connected to any one specific national culture. So this is really the kind of intercultural and transcultural communication we were talking about in previous presentations. And the fourth strand is making use of cultural informants. So these can be non-local English teachers who can share their own cultural backgrounds, provide outsider perspectives on the students' cultures, where the students are in a local setting, so that's really the majority of school ELT classrooms, and discuss their experiences of intercultural communication. Also, local English teachers can discuss their experience of other cultures and using English for intercultural communication. It may also be possible in more diverse classrooms, such as international language schools, that students can act as cultural informants for each other. So if they come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, they can provide information and experiences to share with each other. Now, of course, these experiences and impressions will necessarily be subjective and partial, but they still provide valuable and useful first-hand accounts of culture and intercultural communication through global Englishes, as long as they are approached critically. Okay, and finally, and probably the most crucial element, is engaging in intercultural communication, both face-to-face and digitally. So experience of intercultural and transcultural communication and reflection on that experience is critical in developing intercultural awareness. So the traditional way of doing this has been studying abroad and short-term student exchanges. So where students spend time in another culture using the language of that culture. However, for global Englishes, it's important to stress that any context where students will have the opportunity to use their English for intercultural communication are relevant. And multilingual and multicultural environments are probably especially relevant, and they'll be more relevant than Anglophone settings, although it should also be recognised that many Anglophone settings, such as international universities, are also highly multilingual and multicultural. But there may also be opportunities in the local environment to engage in intercultural communication. In super diverse urban centres such as large cities, there will be large multilingual and multicultural populations where students can experience intercultural communication, or in settings with high numbers of international tourists. There are also opportunities for intercultural interactions. However, it must be recognised that things like study abroad and student exchanges are expensive and difficult to organise, and of course not all students are in local environments that are very diverse and multilingual and multicultural. But another way of bringing intercultural communication into the classroom is through what are often referred to as teletandem virtual online exchanges. So this is where learners are matched with other language learners in another country via things like email, video, social networking sites. Yeah, and there are many websites you can go to where you can find people who are looking for learners in other countries to match their learners to. And this is an excellent way of allowing learners time to engage in intercultural communication in the classroom. Now it's important that all of these five strands are approached critically, and any representational construction of culture in them is not just accepted as presented, but is critically evaluated. Equally important is that space is given to explore and reflect and discuss on intercultural experiences. So development of intercultural awareness is a long-term process and not necessarily a smooth and straightforward one. So time for reflection and discussion is really important. The five strands are also not presented as a teaching methodology, rather they're broad guidelines, some of which may be more or less applicable in different contexts. However, studies so far have shown that intercultural awareness is a relevant approach, both in terms of developing materials and approaches to teaching culture, but also in documenting students' awareness and development of intercultural awareness. So moving between, for example, level 1 and 2 of intercultural awareness. So that's from a kind of basic understanding of culture and intercultural communication to a more advanced understanding of culture and intercultural communication. So far studies have been conducted in places as varied as Thailand, China, Indonesia, Japan and Iran. So to summarise this presentation, it's important that culture and language are integrated systematically into teaching rather than as a final fifth skill to be added when there is time and ignored when there is not. To integrate the intercultural adequately into teaching, we need to take a critical, non-essentialist and non-stereotype perspective on language and culture. And we need to recognise that global Englishes involves multilingualism and interculturality. We need to focus on the processes of communication, not the products or facts. They're still useful, but by themselves, products and facts are not enough. In terms of the goals, this should be intercultural communicative competence and awareness, and that involves the knowledge, skills and attitudes needed for intercultural and transcultural communication through global Englishes. And in terms of the model, we need to move away from an idealised monolingual native speaker to an intercultural speaker or citizen as the model for a successful communicator through global Englishes. These are my references. Dr. Shah.